Let's talk about growing houseplants. I'm going to tell you how I grow them, and in the process, I'm going to debunk a whole bunch of houseplant myths. It'll make you a better indoor gardener. Let's start with something really basic. How do you water a houseplant? Well, this is the rule I see all over the place. Water your houseplants once a week. And that's just a terrible rule. In fact, most rules in gardening are not worth following. They help sometimes, but you actually have to understand what you're doing. The picture here is one of my streptocarpus. This is one of my new loves. These plants bloom all year long, and a plant like this can have 40, 50 flowers on it at one time. They're absolutely great plants. But one of the things I learned while growing these plants is that when they're in flower, they need to be watered almost twice as often as the same size plant without flowers. Why is that? Well, it turns out that flowers lose a lot of moisture. So the water's being sucked up by the roots, comes up to the flowers, and evaporates. A plant that has a lot of flowers needs to be watered more than one without flowers. In the wintertime, many of us are heating our homes, and that heating process dries the air in our home. Dry air, lower humidity, that means you have to water your plants more. If you're in a tropical climate, well, you might have high humidity at this time of the year. That means you have to water less often. There is no one rule that will tell you when to water your plants. This is really simple. Touch the soil. Or, once you get used to it, just lift the pot. We call that hefting the pot. And you can tell right away by the weight of the pot whether or not it needs watering. So when do you water your plants? It's real simple. You water them when they need it. Don't follow a rule for watering. What about chlorine? This again is one of these standard rules. Get your tap water, let it sit for 24 hours, and let that chlorine evaporate. Is that something you have to do? Well, it's much more complicated than that. First of all, there are two different ways to chlorinate the water. Some municipalities use chlorine, and others use a chemical called chloramine. It's important which one you have. Chlorine evaporates, so if it sits for 24 hours, you will have less chlorine in the water. On the other hand, if your municipality is using chloramine, you can let it sit for weeks, and you're not going to reduce the amount of chlorine in that water. Chloramine does not evaporate. But let's ask a more basic question. Is this chlorine in the water a problem? And the answer is no. If you actually look at the amount of chlorine that we use for treating our drinking water, it's about 1/100th of the amount of chlorine that will harm plants. What that means is that chlorine in drinking water does not affect plants. In fact, chlorine is a micronutrient, and plants do need a very small amount of it. What about misting? People mist their plants to increase humidity. Now, a lot of our house plants are tropical plants, and they're used to growing in areas that have higher humidity. So this kind of makes sense, right? You create a humidity dome around these plants, and they're happier. Well, this doesn't really work either. And the reason is that the droplets you put on the plant evaporate very quickly. Now, when you mist, you do increase the humidity around the plant for a few minutes. But after about 10-20 minutes, those water droplets have evaporated, so there's no longer any water to evaporate, and the humidity falls back to where it was before you misted. So yeah, misting works, as long as you do it every 20 minutes, day and night. Misting is really just a silly idea. Don't do it. Here's another problem that misting causes. If your water is hard, has magnesium and calcium in it, you leave behind these deposits. So if you get these deposits in your kettle, you'll also get them on your plants if you mist too much. That's not good for the plant. So let's skip the misting altogether. Another option is to use Pebble trays. And I see people advising to use Pebble trays all over the internet. Well, it turns out Pebble trays don't work. And by the way, the slide there is showing some more of my streptocarpus seedlings. As I said, they're beautiful and they come in so many different colors. This is what happens over a Pebble tray. If we look at an area about 1.5 inches above the water level, we've increased the humidity about 3%. If we get to the top of the pot, we increase the humidity by about 1%. 1% increase does nothing for the plant. In fact, most humidifiers, they only come on when the humidity is down about 5%, and then they raise it back up again. A 1% increase in humidity does nothing for our plants. What happens here is the water evaporates, and right above the water you do have a higher humidity dome, but then it spreads throughout the whole room, and there isn't enough water there to increase the humidity level in the room. So pebble trays simply don't work. Here's a picture of a really sad little plant. It's an orchid. And if you look at the lower leaves, they're quite wrinkled. This is a sign of not being watered enough, right? Well, not necessarily. When we look at these plants, the wrinkleness and the fact that the leaves are kind of drooping does indicate that the plant is not getting enough moisture. But there are two possible causes for that. One is that the plant hasn't been watered for a long time, and so there's no moisture for the roots to get, and so the leaves start wrinkling. But another possibility is that you've been watering too much, and that has rotted the roots, and without roots, the plant can't absorb any water. So the leaves become wrinkled because the plant can't get water. It's not because you haven't been watering it. Now this poor little orchid here should have been repotted 2 or 3 years ago. You can see that the growth area in the bottom of the leaves is way above the soil level. That's way too high. It should be down soil level. The soil looks like peat moss or maybe real soil. That's not what we use for repotting orchids. Now, if you're interested in learning how to grow orchids, I have a whole series of videos for repotting them and how to water them and how to care for them. Orchids are one of the easiest houseplants to grow, and it's also one of those plants that a lot of people struggle with because people like to overwater, and that can damage orchids. This poor little guy, if it's repotted and treated properly, he'll be fine, and in a year and a half from now, he'll flower again. All right, let's go on to media. Media is the word we should be using instead of soil. Most of us, when we're growing houseplants, we don't use real soil. We don't have any sand, silt, and clay in that pot. Now, I know some people do, and in some parts of the world that is popular. And so if you do have real soil in your pot, that's fine. You can grow plants that way. But in this program, I'm going to talk about soilless media. And that's the most common solution in North America and Europe. The two most common items that we use for this is peat moss and coir. So on the left there, you see a little picture of a bag of peat moss. It's a plant that's harvested. The material is organic matter. It's fluffy. It has lots of air in there, and it grows really good plants. A lot of people have become very negative about peat moss, and they're recommending that we shouldn't use it. And instead, people are switching to coir. Now, I've looked at these stories, and I've analyzed them on my gardenmyths.com website. It turns out that what you've been told about peat moss and the problems of using peat moss are mostly incorrect. And the fact that coir, which is shredded coconut husk, is reported to be a waste product and we might as well use it, well, that's not entirely correct either. It is a waste product, but in order to turn it into coir, which we can use for houseplants, it has to be washed with fresh water. We have to get the salt out of that coir. And that's causing a great deal of environmental problems in places like India and Sri Lanka where this material is made. Well, let's get back to this peat moss. Should we stop using it? Well, as I said, I've written an article about that, and you can read all the details. But let me just point out a couple really important ones. So here I have a series of squares. Each square represents 1,000,000 tons of peat moss. There are 20 of them. Naturally, every year we grow 20 million tons. This is a global number. It grows naturally in nature. Out of that 20 million tons of new material, we harvest 1 million tons. And that's for all uses. So 20 million grows every year. We harvest 1 million. So at the end of the year, we have a lot more than we started with. And this happens year after year after year. We're not running out of peat moss. Harvesting of peat moss is not getting rid of our bogs. It's not damaging wetland. Those are all myths. Here's how the harvested peat moss is used. 51% is used by agriculture. 26% goes into forestry. 22% is harvested from tropical areas. And a meager 1% is for heating and horticulture. So that small black sliver, that's heating plus horticulture, and horticulture is less than 1% of that. Using peat moss in potted plants is not harming the environment in any way. Now, in addition to peat moss or coir, we generally add some other materials to that. And two common items are perlite and vermiculite. Both of these are mined materials, and then they're processed with high temperatures. A lot of recipes for soil use both peat moss and vermiculite. And I always wondered, well, why do we use both? I mean, the reason for using one of them is that we add more porosity to the mix. We make it even fluffier. And some plants like the extra air in the potting medium. But why do we use both of these? So I had a close look at these and compared them. Perlite doesn't really compress. With pressure, it does kind of fall apart. Vermiculite compresses, and that's one reason why some people don't like it. The pH is about the same. The CEC is close to being the same. It's not significant enough for me to put both in. Next item on the list is what most people refer to, the water holding capacity. And it turns out that vermiculite holds a lot more water than perlite. And so some people like to add that so that there's extra moisture available to roots. But that's not the only important number. We have to look at the next number on that list, and this is the freely available water. It really doesn't matter how much the material holds. What's important to the plants is how much does it actually release to the plants, and that's the freely available water. And as you can see, perlite is 20% and vermiculite is 30%. Well, those are almost the same numbers. When you go down this list of differences, there are some minor differences. But quite honestly, I can't think of any good reason to use both in a mix. Use one or the other, whichever you prefer, but there's no point in using both. Now, there are a lot of other amendments that get added to potting medium. We're going to go through this list very quickly. Mycorrhizal fungi, you can buy those in containers and add it to your mix. There's absolutely no point in doing that. We're not trying to grow fungi in our pots. Bacteria is another one that you can now purchase and add. No point in adding that either. Bloom boosters. I mean, everybody wants more flowers and bigger flowers. So manufacturers sell bloom boosters, and those are generally fertilizers with a high middle number, a high phosphate number. Well, it turns out that if your plants are getting reasonable amounts of nutrients, bloom boosters don't work. The only reason we keep selling them is because gardeners keep buying them. We could add some humus, but, well, you know from my Garden Myths blog that humus doesn't exist, so we don't have to add that either. Then there's charcoal and sand. Now, both of those are ingredients that we could add to a mix. If we want to make our peat moss mix very porous and have lots of air in there, both charcoal and sand could be added, and they do work quite well for that purpose. But that's only necessary for special plants. So things like cactus, for instance, we generally add a lot of sand because we want those very, very porous compared to most of our other houseplants. So in general, unless you have a special situation, you really don't have to add any of these. Now, I quickly mentioned that you shouldn't add bacteria and mycorrhizal fungi. So let's ask a really fundamental question here. Do you need microbes? I mean, if you've been in gardening for a while, you know that there's a big push in increasing the number of microbes we have in our soil. And that is a valid concept. We want to have more microbes in our soil, because it's the microbes that make that soil better. They create aggregation. It's the microbes that digest organic matter and release nutrients for plants. In soil, out in the garden, microbes are important. Now, I still don't think you should be adding them, but we certainly should be doing things in the garden to encourage their growth. We do want more of them. What about houseplants? Well, if you remember, I said houseplants don't generally grow in soil. We're not trying to improve the soil structure because we don't even have soil. When we have potted plants, what we do is we go out and we already buy the structure when we start. And that's why we use peat moss. That's why it's so popular. It has the perfect structure for growing houseplants. Because we don't have any soil, we don't need the microbes. So there's no point in trying to grow microbes in a potted plant. Let's start talking about fertilizer. What should we be adding? I see a question like this a lot online. Someone asks, how much fertilizer do you use? And they get answers like this. So answer number 1, I use 1/4 teaspoon in my water. A different answer comes back. Answer number 2, I use half strength of what the container said. I see lots of answers like that, and people are quite satisfied with these answers, but the answers are useless. They don't tell us anything because there isn't enough information for us to know what that person is actually doing. Now let's ask the question again and give a proper answer. The question, how much fertilizer do you use? The answer, well, I use an NPK of 547. Or I could give the name of the fertilizer and the reader could look it up and find out what the NPK is. But it's crucial that I include the NPK in that information. The second piece of information I need is the amount used. That's that 1/8 teaspoon. The third piece of information is the amount of water I use for mixing this. Did I put that in a liter? Did I put it in a gallon? Did I put it in an 18-liter pail? That's crucial to understanding how I mixed up this fertilizer. And the last one is how often did I apply it? If I'm applying this every 3 or 4 days, I'm probably using a slightly lower amount than if I'm applying it once a month. So the frequency that it's applied is also critical. Unless the answer includes all 4 pieces of information, it's useless because it really doesn't tell you anything. Here's another fertilizer myth that's extremely common. Even university extension offices make this mistake. NPK represents 10% nitrogen, 10% phosphorus, and 10% potassium. I see that all the time. In fact, I just read it a couple days ago in a document that really should know better. That is false. A fertilizer that's marked as a 10-10-10 is not 10% of each of those nutrients. In fact, the numbers work out like this. The first number is the percent nitrogen. It's 10% nitrogen. The second number is the percent of P2O5. It's not the percent of phosphorus. And the third number is the percent K2O, not the percent of potassium. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, well, what's the big deal? Why is that important? Well, it's really important if you're trying to calculate the right amount of fertilizer that you need. It turns out that a 10-10-10 is actually 10% nitrogen, 4% phosphorus, and 8% potassium. I've rounded those off a little bit. You can look up more exact numbers, but that's close enough for most gardeners. This can be critical if you're calculating the amount of fertilizer you use. Here's another big fertilizer myth. How many of you have used orchid fertilizer? Well, I have news for you. There is no such thing. Now, granted, you can go to the store and you can buy some, and there's lots of people that talk about it and manufacturers make it, but it doesn't actually exist, except in the minds of marketing people and the gardeners who buy the products. There is no such thing as plant-specific fertilizer. Orchid fertilizer, African violet fertilizer, houseplant fertilizer, tomato fertilizer, rose fertilizer, all those specialties, they don't actually exist. If you look at the ingredients, they're all the same. They all use the basic nutrients to make up those fertilizers. If you don't believe me about that, here's a little experiment you can do for yourself. Go to the internet and look up some fertilizer. And I've done that for you here. So I picked 3 houseplant fertilizers. So the first one is a 547. The next one is a 15-30-15. And the third one is an 8-3-1. Now notice that the NPK ratios here are all different. Now, I'm not talking about the absolute numbers, I'm talking about the ratio. So in the third one there, for instance, it has a lot more nitrogen than potassium. It has more nitrogen than the middle number, which is phosphorus. In the first one, they're about the same. It's a 5-4-7, so almost the same of each nutrient. The middle one says, well, houseplants need a high amount of the middle number, the phosphate. These are all different. How can they all be houseplant fertilizer and all have different ratios of NPK? Well, the reason is that there's no such thing as houseplant fertilizer. You can make any kind of mixture you want and slap a label on it and call it houseplant fertilizer. In fact, none of those 3 are good choices because it turns out that plants, both houseplants and garden plants, tend to use fertilizer in the ratio of 3-1-2. That means a lot more nitrogen than the phosphate, and the potassium is kind of halfway between the two. Now, your fertilizer could be a 3-1-2, or a 6-2-4, or a 9-3-6. Those are all the same ratio, but the ratio you want is a 3-1-2. Here's another very common myth. Synthetic fertilizer kills microbes. Well, that simply isn't true. Let's see what happens when we add some synthetic fertilizer on soil. This is what happens. We have a certain population of microbes. We add the fertilizer and the numbers go up for a short while. And then they come crashing back down and they're back to where they started. And why is this? Well, fertilizer is microbe food. Microbes need nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, calcium, all the nutrients that plants need, microbes need it too. And by the way, animals also need all those. Every living organism needs those same nutrients. The difference between plants and animals is that plants can only use them as the simple ion chemicals found in fertilizers, whereas humans can take a steak and digest it until it releases those nutrients. But we still need to get those nutrients. So in fact, if you add fertilizer to soil, you actually see an increase in microbes. Now it's a short burst and doesn't last very long because the fertilizer gets used up and gets washed away, but you increase them. You don't kill the microbes by adding fertilizer. Here's some common myths. Phosphorus grows roots. Phosphorus stimulates flowers. Nitrogen grows leaves. This Jack's Bloom Booster fertilizer is a 10-30-20. Now the middle number is really high. That's the phosphorus because gardeners believe that that stimulates flowers. It's even called a bloom booster. They simply don't work. Extra phosphorus does not make more flowers. Now, if your plant is starving for phosphorus and there's none in the pot and you add a little bit, then you will get a better growing plant and you will get more flowers. But if you have a reasonable amount there already, adding more is not going to help. Don't buy Bloom Boost. So how much fertilizer should you use? Gardeners like to talk in terms of teaspoons per gallon, but that doesn't really tell us how many nutrients we're really adding. That's a measure of the amount of fertilizer, but not the amount of nutrient. We haven't taken into account the NPK. So what gardeners should start doing is talking in terms of ppm. That's parts per million. All of the scientific journals use parts per million. All the researchers use parts per million. All the nurseries who are growing our plants use parts per million. They're not going around talking about teaspoons per gallon. And it turns out that if we get around 100 ppm of nitrogen, that's a good level of fertilizer. Now, you're probably not familiar with ppm, so here's some simple rules for figuring out what it is. It turns out that 1 teaspoon of a 10% nitrogen fertilizer, so that's an NPK with 10 as the first number, and if we add that to 1 gallon of water, we produce 132 ppm nitrogen. 132 is close enough to 100. That works quite well. Now, if you don't have a 10% NPK, you can always use a 20% NPK. And then you use half a teaspoon of a 20% or a third teaspoon of a 30%. That will give you approximately 100 ppm. And that's what you should be using to fertilize your plants all of the time. I put that directly into the water I use for watering them, and I water my houseplants all the time with 100 ppm nitrogen. Nurseries and production facilities tend to use higher numbers. They're closer to 200 and 250 parts per million, but they test it all the time and they control it really well. So I think a safer number for homeowners is the 100 ppm. The other important thing for plants is light. And there's lots of discussions now about using LED lights, and we're going to have a look at some of these terms. But first I'd like to show you these tomato seedlings that are growing on a really bright window. What's important for gardeners to understand is that this window looks bright to us. Our eyes are actually very sensitive to light. As far as the tomato is concerned, it's living in a dark cave. This is not a lot of light for a tomato plant. Many times home gardeners think that they're giving their plants lots of light, and they're really not. You'll see plants grow much better, flower much better, if you increase the amount of light for them. Unfortunately, our windows can only do so much. If that's not enough light, we have to go to an artificial light. And these days, the only thing I would consider are LED bulbs. Now, I'm going to give you a couple simple solutions in a few seconds, but I want to go through some terms because we have to start understanding LED terms. The ones we used to use for fluorescent bulbs, they don't apply anymore. So in the old days, when we talked about fluorescent bulbs, we talk about a temperature like 3000 Kelvin. K stands for Kelvin. or a 5,000 Kelvin. And that told you whether it was a bluish light or a yellowish light. And that worked well for fluorescent lights where all the manufacturers were pretty much producing the same kind of bulbs. It doesn't work for LED lights. So referring to your light in terms of Kelvin doesn't really tell you anything. The other term that people like to throw around there is watts. I've got a 50-watt lamp. Unfortunately for LEDs, you can't translate watts into the amount of light you actually get out of them. That's another myth people have. So you could have two lamps, both 50 watts, and one may give much better light output than the other. The third term that we should know is PAR. And PAR is a measure of the amount of light from a plant's perspective. We look at the light that plants use and we figure out how much it uses at different wavelengths, and we come up with this number that represents how much plant light our bulb is giving off, as opposed to the light that we get in our eyes. So PAR can be important. If you're going to buy an LED grow lamp, you should always see the spectra in the marketing material. If it doesn't have the spectra, it's not a real grow light. Because I can take any LED light and call it a grow light. But if I haven't measured the spectra and I don't know the light I'm actually producing, I don't have a grow light. What you want to do is look for a spectra that has a peak in the blue range, peak in the red range, and some green light. Now, we used to think plants don't use green light because they reflect it. That's why they look green. But in fact, green light is actually quite important for proper plant growth. And we actually want a little bit down in the 700 range. That's the infrared range. And we want light there too. But we want to see the spectra. That tells us that this manufacturer actually cares about the light they're producing. The other thing that's absolutely critical is to see one of these PPFD maps. This is a map of the area underneath the light, and it indicates how much light you have, how much quantity of light is hitting that surface under the light. And generally you get it at different heights. So this particular manufacturer is giving us the values at 12 inches, 14 inches, and 18 inches. So let's have a closer look at the 12-inch one. You can see the number in the middle there is 928. That's a PPFD value. That's a measure of how much PAR light we get right in the middle of the lamp. And you can see that as you move towards the outside of the lamp, you get less and less light. So the sides are about 550 and the corners are about 350. So this tells you the amount of light you can expect 1 foot below this light. And now you can ask yourself, is that enough light to grow my plant? Is this a good light? Is it going to give me what I need to grow my plant? And that's why this map is so important. If the manufacturer does not provide this in their marketing material, this is not a grow light. This is just a light that they think you can use for plants, but you don't know how much light you're getting. So you don't know which plants will grow under it, and you don't know how close to put the light to your plants. So this is absolutely necessary. So how much light do you need? Well, here's a little chart that will give you some guidance. If you're in the 100 to 300 ppfd, that's good for seedlings. Personally, I would prefer my seedlings at the high end because I want them very stocky. I don't want any leggy seedlings. So I'd probably be looking at 250, 300 for a seedling. If I'm growing things like lettuce and I'm not expecting it to flower, then 200 to 600 works for leafy material. If I'm trying to flower this plant, so I'm growing Streptocarpus or African violets and I want lots of flowers, I have to get over 600. So now I have a way of knowing how good my lamp is and exactly what I can grow underneath it. Now let me give you a couple options. If you're looking for your first grow light and you're looking for something relatively simple, probably for seedlings or some low light plants, then the best choice are these LED shop lights. Go to a hardware store, buy these, they're 4 feet long, get at least 2 lights and preferably 3 lights together, and that will grow some nice plants. It's not a lot of light, and you're going to have to keep these lights pretty close to the plants. Now when you buy this shop light, you're not going to get a PPFD map. In fact, you're not even going to be told what the spectra is because these aren't grow lights. But they are LED lights and they give out a pretty good light for growing plants. And the reason you might choose these is that the cost is pretty low. Now, if you want something a step up from there, then you can look at real LED grow lights. And I have one picture there. They generally come as a rectangular light. They have the LEDs all inserted in that aluminum plate. A manufacturer who's making that will show you the spectra and the PPFT map, so you'll know exactly how strong it is. That will then allow you to compare different manufacturers and their prices to see which lamp is best for your situation. Now on the right there, I've pictured a different LED grow light, but these aren't really LED grow lights. These are just things that you can buy on Amazon. They're very inexpensive, and they always show them with plants underneath. But the amount of light given off by these is quite low. You don't know anything about the spectra. You don't know anything about the power light you're getting. These aren't really grow lights. One final comment. You've been growing a houseplant and you're starting to have some problems. And you go online and you want some help with that. And there's lots of places to get help now, especially on Facebook. There's all kinds of plant groups in there. You post a picture of your plant and you ask the question, what's wrong with my plant? What should I do different? I see that all the time. Hundreds of posts like that. And most of them will get answers. You'll get 20, 30 people giving you answers. And all those answers, they're absolutely useless. Because the people giving you answers are guessing at what you've done with your plant. You haven't told them anything about the plant. You haven't told them about your procedures. So they don't have the information to actually diagnose a problem. If you want to get an answer to the question, you have to give them information. How long have you been growing the plant? What is the name of the plant? How are you fertilizing it? How are you watering it? How much humidity does it get? Has it had any pest problems? Have you seen any pests? Every bit of information you provide helps someone else diagnose that problem. And without a clear picture of the whole thing, the answers are kind of meaningless. If you'd like to get in touch with me, there are several ways you can connect. I have a YouTube channel where you're probably watching this video. My handle there is Garden Fundamentals. We have a Facebook group that you're welcome to come and join and ask all the questions you have about gardening, and we'll ensure that you get the right answer. And we also have a podcast. All three of those are called Garden Fundamentals. My main blog is called gardenmyths.com, and there are over 700 articles on there that cover probably 3,000 different gardening myths. You're welcome to come there and browse all you want. I hope you enjoyed this program. Here's a couple more videos you'll really like. This one over here shows you how to repot orchids. And up here, I have a video that shows you how to get rid of scale and mealybugs. Happy gardening.